How's it going, everybody? My name's Parallax Abstraction, and welcome to Retro Flashback, showcasing gaming's roots for a new generation. So today we're diving back into the TurboGrafx-16 library. It's been a little while since I've done one of these, and well, this title was, my desire to cover this title was actually inspired from Giant Bomb's recent stream where they dug into some TurboGrafx stuff. I actually played this game back when I had my own TurboGrafx, and I remember liking it quite fondly. They were kind of so-so on it, but they didn't play it very much. And this is a fairly fondly remembered launch game, actually, from the TurboGrafx era, so I thought I'd take a look at this. So, we are taking a look at the legendary Axe, which was developed by, you might be wondering, who the hell is Victor Musical Industries? Yeah, not a developer that many people have heard of necessarily. Well, let me put it into a little bit of perspective. Have you ever heard potentially of JVC, big Japanese electronics manufacturer that's still around but not necessarily as big as they used to be? Used to have their hands in a whole pile of stuff. Well, Victor Musical Industries was their sort of media division, kind of like, you know how Sony has Sony Pictures Entertainment and Sony Music Entertainment. That was kind of JVC's attempt at that, because JVC, for those who don't know, actually stands for Japan Victor Company. That's what the... Oh, that demo guy didn't work out so well. So that's what this became, and they dabbled into video games and didn't meet a lot of success with it. Didn't keep doing it for too long, and very, very little outside of Japan. So Victor Musical Industries eventually became, or at least their games division eventually became Victor Interactive Software, and to this day they are still around and known as Victor Entertainment, though they have not been involved in video games for quite some time. But they were one of, and this is possibly contributed to their downfall, they were one of the original third-party developers who signed on to the TurboGrafx in a big way. Because as we know, or those of you who follow this know, the TurboGrafx was a console developed by Hudson Soft from Japan. NEC was sort of their hardware partner and the company who released the system stateside. So Hudson made a bunch of games for it, but as with any console launch, third-party support is key. So they signed on some Japanese developers, a couple of big ones, and some other ones that were lesser known to make software for it, and Victor was one of them. So what we got here is what on the surface looks like potentially a fairly standard action platformer. Maybe in the vein kind of in like a Castlevania or something to that effect, but this has some neat twists on it, which I think make it a little bit more interesting. For starters, you can see this is in kind of a caveman-like setting, which is a little bit different, which also but it's like a caveman setting with mystical influences, because you can see I'm like killing giant spiders and orcs and other things like that. It's kind of a weird mashup of stuff in that regard. So you see we got like these orc guys here, which is a little different. Second big mechanic that I really like, and I think is what sells this game. So, I mean, this game does have a story. I mean, it's not really explained in the game at all. It's kind of touched on in the manual, but basically your girlfriend or lady friend, Flair, has been kidnapped, and you are endeavoring to try to get her back. That's the whole point of this. I mean, less of a story than Castlevania, perhaps, but Castlevania's story was really just, hey, Dracula, kill him. So about to get to the end of the first level here, actually. So the main mechanic about this game that makes it a little bit different from the others out there is that, well, your only weapon in this game is, well, an axe. Doesn't look too legendary at the start. I mean, honestly, it doesn't do a ton of damage or anything like that. Alright, here's the first boss. These crazy feral bears. So, what's the twist? And how does this make up for having only one friggin' weapon? Well, let's see if I can pattern my way out of these guys. So how this makes up for only having one weapon is you may see at the top, I love how that big, like, whole level flash in the back where it's like, congratulations for beating this. I clear first zone. So we're moving on to the next one here. So, what is the main sort of drawing mechanic of this? Well, you see that bar we got at the top there, and how I'm kind of glowing now for some reason. So, if you played Castlevania or seen my video on that, you'll know that the main weapon that the character has in that game is his whip, and that it actually has 3 levels. It starts off as sort of a normal weak sauce leather whip, and then as you play a little bit, it becomes a chain whip and then a longer chain whip. Now, the problem with the way Castlevania does it is the upgrade system is kind of pointless because you always get the 2 upgrades almost immediately. Like, there's very little delay in it, and really, if you're even beyond the most basically skilled at the game, you're gonna get the full whip. In this game, there are 4 stages of your legendary axe power-up that you can get, which you pick up either from big enemies, as you saw in the first level, or sometimes from just those little idle power-up statues, which occasionally contain health points or extra lives or axe upgrades. And this is what's interesting about it. So there are 4 upgrades to the axe, and you're seeing here every time I'm swinging, the bar is recharging. So that's my attack power. Each level of the axe is actually more powerful than the last, so your attack power goes up, you do more damage per shot. But it only works at its full capacity when the bar is fully charged. So you're allowed to swing more frequently than the bar recharges, but by doing that, you're doing less impact per shot. So you kind of have to strategize how you play here, because if you're trying to do crowd control, you may need to be shooting fairly quickly. Kind of like with these guys, because if you stab these guys rapidly, they won't sort of hop around and make it harder to kill them. But it also takes a lot more shots to do that. I could have killed those, like if I do this. So 1 full shot, 2 full shots, 3 full shots, as opposed to like 6 I had to do when I was doing it weekly. So it really changes your strategy on a per enemy basis, and you really have to be careful. There's some health power-ups there. So it really makes things a little bit different in terms of how you have to approach enemies in crowd control, whereas in games like Castlevania, you can do that by the use of your secondary weapons, which have limited amounts of use, or by just sort of button mashing your way through it. Oh yeah, also there's boulders that attack you in this game, because of course there is. Took him out. Oh yeah, and the boss of this level is a giant boulder, because of course it is. Whoops. Actually didn't hit him there. So that's the interesting mechanic that not a lot of other games did, that I think really differentiates this from the crowd, is this unique mechanic of having 1 weapon that you power up and that you... Whoops. Usually I can get this guy without too much trouble, but I'm kind of screwing this up here. There we go. And out we go. So that's kind of the interesting thing that I really like, is you can play the game a number of different ways as a result of that, by really strategizing how frequently you button mash your shots, whether you button mash your shots at all, and attacking certain enemies with high power as opposed to low power. And you can also get kind of screwed over by the fact that you see all the levels have those little enemies, like those little sort of butterfly things, or the bats, or whatever, which you sometimes need to hit just to clear them out, but are also valuable for getting points, because this game is much like Castlevania in that it has a fairly in-depth scoring system, but it has no high score mechanic, which still bugs me, because again, that's something that's very easy to implement. But you do get extra lives based on score, so you are incentivized to try to get as much score as possible. And the way this game works is, the one thing I tend to hate about a lot of games that do have an iterative power-up mechanics, like say something like an R-Type, is that when you die in R-Type, one of the real gripes about R-Type is that when you die in it, you can get as far as you can with the power-ups you have, but once you die in R-Type, you lose everything. And you're taken back to a position not that far from where you died. So in R-Type, you basically die once, and you're pretty much going back to square one and being expected to tackle a higher level with less power, which I always thought was really cheap. I mean, that was an arcade mechanic that they really kept. See ya. That was an arcade design trope that they kept even in later versions of R-Type because it's just what people expected. Oh, right, he respawns. And I was never a big fan of that. In this game, it's still a little mean, but not nearly as mean as you're going to see here. So when you die, you only lose one segment. Now, if I die again without recharging that segment, I'll lose the other one. And that's... then you're kind of screwed. But I will be able, I actually know where I'm able to get the other charge up here. So I do have to be a little more careful now because, as you can see, I can't do as much damage to, say, these bird creatures, which is going to take a little bit more strategizing. So you got to be a little bit more careful. But I know where I'm going to be able to rejuice here, and it should be no big deal. Whoops. Oh, he's a little bugger. There we go. So we got him. And there it is. So it definitely requires a little more strategy and utilizing what you have, but it doesn't. What I like about it is that it doesn't require perfection, which is essentially what R-Type does. Like I said, in R-Type, you screw up once and the game arbitrarily punishes you to a very severe degree. It essentially wants you to perfect run the game, whereas this one gives you multiple chances. And while it's going to require you to be careful about things, it's also not nearly as mean about it, which I really like. In addition to that, I mean, for a fairly novice developer as a launch title, this was a launch game on the TurboGrafx, I'm really impressed with the production values of this. I think the game looks really good. I think it has a lot of really... I think it has a really nice color palette. The backgrounds look nice. A little bit of parallax would have been nice, but that's, can't expect everything. And the thing that I really love, and this is where, sort of Victor Musical Industries really earns their name, perhaps, is that this has a really good soundtrack. This is one of the... because not a lot of people played this game. Ooh, hello. Not a lot of people are familiar with the soundtrack, but some people consider this sort of a soundtrack that if you're a big chiptune nut, you really need to have in your repertoire because, yeah, I mean, you're sort of playing a medieval character. Ooh. You're playing sort of a medieval character, and this is kind of an interesting funkified soundtrack, but I really, really like it. It's very memorable. The songs are fairly long, and it's just very catchy and sort of just makes you enjoy playing it. Ooh, there's a lot of these guys. I don't remember this. This is the other thing that I like about it as well, is I do find the enemy behaviors a little bit more interesting. Everybody has a pattern, as is the case with most of these games. But in Castlevania, I like Castlevania a lot, but I always found the patterns in that game to be somewhat bland and uninteresting. This one is, the enemies hop around, like, you'll see variations on different enemies, like that sort of orc guy. We've seen multiple variations of them now, which not only have different hit points, but different behaviors. So, their jump and dodge patterns are different. They have different, some of them have throwing weapons, some of them have... As you can see, these guys have more hit points, but also more throwing weapons. Oh, bugger. And things like that. And I think the enemy behavior is a little more interesting, but I would also say this game is not... Now, I've never finished this, to be fair. It charged me up right away. Oh, this took me a ways back, too. I've never finished this game, but I would say, based on my experience thus far, that the challenge level is also not as bad. To call it easy would definitely be unfair. It's not easy, but it's not Castlevania level of crazy, especially in the boss fights. The bosses... the boss patterns are fairly straightforward. Once you get the basics down, they're pretty easy to avoid. I mean, as you saw with the first two, it's just dodge jump under the bears, or rather let the bears jump over you, I guess, and use the rope to dodge the barrel. Pretty straightforward. But I also like the fact that the levels have different paths you can take. As you saw in the beginning, the first level, there was sort of that lower area you could go into where you could fight that spider. Here you can try to platform across the ropes, which is a little tricky because those ropes, in their perpetual swinging, those ropes are a little off. But ultimately you have to do it anyway, but as you can see, there are multiple paths, and if you take them, you get rewards for it, which is always nice. And, you can always just totally bone the timing, such as I did. So So, nice thing is, as well, you do have continues in this game, though you are limited to 4. So, you do have to finish this within a certain amount. You're not going to be allowed to just sort of, you know, credit feed your way through this, as it were, in order to get to the end. You gotta be prepared to... It definitely still demands a certain amount of skill from you and rewards you for that. But I still like this quite a bit. I mean, as a launch game, it's quite exceptional, actually. I mean, a lot of the TurboGrafx launch games, I actually think the TurboGrafx had one of the better launch libraries, though a lot of people would disagree with me on that. There are a lot of games from the launch of that system that are kind of considered, you know, not so hot, but I quite like this one. I don't know how well it did, but I do know it did well enough to get a sequel a year later. And, well, that is actually what we're going to do next time. I'm not usually into doing series sort of one after the other, but I think it's rather interesting because it's very, very clear that somebody within either Victor or somewhere else thought, you know, that game was cool and unique, but you know what would probably do better if we changed a whole bunch of stuff. And I'm not really going to go into the details of that, but suffice it to say, Legendary Axe 2, while despite being still a competent game in its own right, is to say the least... Oh god, timing while commentating is not a good thing. Nope. Legendary Axe 2, while a competent game in its own right, is, needless to say, very, very different from this one, and generally most people agreed not in a good way. So I think that's what I'm actually going to do in my next episode. Is we're actually going to go straight into Legendary Axe 2, because I think it's very interesting to see how different a series can get after just one iteration, with certain people making different kinds of decisions. But this is something, it didn't go very far. Legendary Axe 2 was sort of the end of this series, and I always found that kind of a bummer, because I really liked this game, and I actually played a decent amount of the second one, too. And I would really like to have seen them do some more stuff with this. I like the idea of the sort of caveman setting. I mean, Hudson Soft kind of took the caveman setting and ran with it with the Bonk games, which are obviously very, very different from this. They're still platformers, but they're much more humorous and much different in a play style. But I would have liked to have seen, you know, this is a setting you don't see used in games very often. I would have liked to have seen that expanded upon. And clearly, the team at Victor who made this was talented. They knew how to make a game that played pretty well, looked pretty good, and sounded fantastic. They really knew what they were doing here. Let's see. I think the key is having these spawn in at certain times. Damn it. But you're getting the idea here anyway of this game. But yeah, I would have liked to have seen them do more with this, but this is actually not only one of the better TurboGrafx games, I think it's just a really, really good platformer in its own right. I'm going to talk about the TurboGrafx a lot on this channel, simply because the TurboGrafx was not without its faults, to be sure, but I really think it was an underappreciated system that had way more good games for it than people give it credit for. A lot of people like to write it off as one of these sort of what were they thinking kind of things, where they just put out the console with a bunch of garbage and it bombed spectacularly. And they made a lot of mistakes with this system, but I really think it had some great stuff on it. And this is among them. I mean, this game can hold its own with a lot of the best NES platformers, if you ask me. Is it Super Mario Brothers? No, of course not. But this system was capable and had developers with capabilities behind it far more than people are willing to acknowledge, in my opinion. And I think that's really a shame. I think this is something that should be better appreciated. But I enjoy this. I think this is pretty fun, and you know, fans of the genre, if you're into action platformers, you know, if you're someone who digs Castlevania or even the Bonk series or any types of those, nope, God, I don't remember that being so brutal. But if you're someone who digs any of these kinds of games, this is a very worthy entry. It's got a different setting, a different weapon mechanic that some people might say having, you know, the one weapon that levels up is a bit of a cop-out because they just didn't want to make, you know, half a dozen different secondary options like the Castlevania games did. You could say that, but I prefer to think of it as that Victor chose to do one thing, to focus on one thing, and do something different with it, and do it really well, as opposed to, as I think many people would agree about Castlevania, do a whole bunch of things and have some of them clearly be far better executed than others. I think a lot of people would agree that a lot of the secondary weapons in the Castlevania games, that game has a number of secondary weapons which are considered pretty useless, or useful only in very specific circumstances. This doesn't have any of those, but you have one weapon, and the enemies are designed entirely around being countered with this one weapon, so only having one weapon can influence how the enemy designs are as well, and affect balance and make things a lot easier, whereas in Castlevania, sometimes the game will hand you a secondary weapon that is all but completely useless in certain situations, and that makes the game that makes the game, oh, hi bear, you're a regular enemy now. Hi. And that makes the game, so as you see here, it's throwing you boss level enemies pretty early on here now. Another thing I like. That is something that Castlevania did do. So yeah, that's why I think the legendary axe. I mean, it's, you know, the game is titled that way for a reason. I think it's really the entire game's design was influenced by that. And here we go to Zone 3B now. I just love how funky this soundtrack is. It doesn't fit the setting at all, but I don't care. This is one of my more favorite songs, actually. Oh, now we got slidey ones. So as you see, its challenge is definitely ramping up here. So, nope. But anyway, you guys get the idea here. So, I like this a lot, and I think designing your entire game around the concept of only having one weapon is a good one. I think it clearly influenced the design of the enemies and the environments and the challenge, and made it so that I think you get something that's far better balanced in the end when you do it this way. And I think Victor did a superb job with it. It's a shame that, well, you'll see. It's a shame that what they did with the sequel did not take those ideas to heart and run with them. Let's just say that. And it's really a shame that Victor Interactive or Victor Musical Industries really didn't stick around in the games business that long, because they clearly had some talent. I would have liked to have seen what they could have kept doing with this. But yeah, that is the Legendary Axe. Developed by Victor Musical Industries / Victor Interactive, and released by NEC, at least in North America. The Japanese version came out in 1988. This version came out in 1989 with the launch of the TurboGrafx. And I really, really like it. I think if you have not had some I think this is a great first title to expose yourself to the TurboGrafx with. And if you like action platformers, this is definitely not one to be missed. It is like most things on the TurboGrafx, it is underappreciated, if you ask me. My name's been Parallax Abstraction. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you next time.